What's happening, YouTube? Owen here from Dark Entertainment, the place to hear tales from Wales and afar. If you're into creepy stories donated to us by people like yourselves, then feel free to like and subscribe, and hit that bell icon. Now, let's get into the video. Well, I'm back, and I finally have a new PC. Right, enough of that. This video today is a little bit different. It's a little different because I haven't included a history section in this bit. You lucky people. No lectures from me today. But instead, I'm going to be focusing on stories that have actually come from the workplace. Specifically, the hospitals that I used to work in. This is going to follow on to another episode from when I worked as an engineer. The single most terrifying experience of my life. The people involved in this episode are friends of mine, but I have no reason to doubt anything that they say. They're not the type of people to entertain thoughts of the supernatural or the paranormal. But it'll be interesting to hear the comments once you've watched the video. But without further ado, let's get into it. Hospitals are intriguing places. They are there when you need them the most. From the first breath of new life to the weakest rasp of old age. The staff support us when things are difficult, and celebrate with us when we beat our ailments. For the staff, working on the wards at times can be a harrowing experience, but can also be the most rewarding job in the world. But occasionally, different stories filter through. I worked on a ward in the University Hospital Wales for the best part of 8 years. I enjoyed the work for the most part, and I worked with some of the most incredible people I have ever met. I'd like to think I was a good nurse, and I had a good head for nursing. However, since I worked on a colorectal surgical ward, and I'm not the most gifted when it comes to luck, I ended up spending most of my time caked from head to toe in bodily fluids. I would always provide new starters with a set of rules. Rule number 1 on that list was that you never change a colostomy bag with your mouth open. I'll leave it to your imagination as to where that rule came from. However, during my time on the ward, I saw many strange things that nurses did, such as opening the window when a patient had passed on to allow the soul to leave, or as one of my more skeptical colleagues remarked, to let the smell leave. With the odd superstition came the inevitable dark story. Since hospitals are often a place of sadness, occasionally the remnants of those who have passed linger within the walls. From the desperate callings of those in pain to the last breath of someone in despair. Today I'm going to focus on 3 separate stories that were told to me by colleagues and staff from the hospitals where I've worked. So join me in looking into the darkness on the wards. As previously stated, I began working on a colorectal ward. When I started, I didn't have much experience, having been made redundant as an engineer, and therefore I was paired with a more experienced nurse named Andrew. Andrew and I got on well and began talking about events and experiences that had happened on the ward. Now, before I continue with the story, I need to explain the layout of the ward which I started on, and the type of operation that we dealt with. This is important when explaining how they reacted. It was an 18-bed ward consisting of 3 4-bed wards and several single cubicles. A diagram of the ward is showing on the screen now. It's not entirely accurate as it's many years since I worked there. As you can see in the diagram, the ward is laid out in a circle shape with all the cubicles and 4-bedders coming off it. This brings me to the type of surgery that many of the patients underwent and the recovery. Many of the patients were on our ward after having undergone bowel surgery for conditions such as colitis, cancer, Crohn's, or things such as stabbings or car accidents. During recovery, we encourage patients to be out of bed as quickly as possible to help get the circulation going, flush the anaesthetic out of the system, and to help in healing. It also helps with flatulence, since during theatre, air is pumped into the bowel to inflate it. Many a person hath trumpeted throughout the corridors of a hospital ward, let me tell you. We noticed that during the night many people suffering with wind would wander in a big loop around the ward. Usually slowly, since surgery would often require the cutting of muscles that needed to repair. One night, Andrew and another colleague were sitting at the reception desk. They were having a chat during a lull in the work. They had been sat there for no more than 10 minutes when they both heard the sound of shuffling feet proceeding down the corridor towards them. As I have previously said, this was not uncommon due to the type of surgery, so Andrew and Steve continued to talk. As the footsteps shuffled closer, they turned to see which patient was completing their laps. The footsteps wandered right up to the edge of the corridor and stopped. Andrew called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer. Andrew and Steve glanced at each other in confusion. Then Andrew leant back on his wheelie chair and pushed himself over to stare up the corridor. As he glided into view, his body went cold. The corridor was empty. He glanced back at Steve before saying, "There's no one there." The corridor was completely empty and anyone in the corridor would have had nowhere to go. They quickly decided that it was time to get back to work and tried to take their mind off the thought of a phantom patient doing their laps. Not far from the ward are the theatres. One theatre in particular had a strange reputation. Theatre 8, like most theatres in teaching hospitals, has a viewing port with cameras and screens for students to be able to witness operations taking place. However, Theatre 8 is a bit different. Nurses and doctors alike have reported that the figure of a female nurse or matron can be seen through the viewing screens watching the surgeries. She has been spotted in the room by people entering, and as they lay eyes on her, she vanishes. The screens have been reported to turn on and off during surgery, and the lights have been said to flicker. These faults have been investigated, but the engineers state that there is no fault. It is unknown who the spectral figure is, but she appears to be more of a motherly figure, as opposed to a sinister entity. The next few stories are slightly darker and were told to me by a friend. He and several colleagues work in one of the oldest surviving hospitals in South Wales. Llandoch Hospital was built in the early 20th century. Its original design consists of a large link corridor and several large Nightingale wards extending from it. As expected, the age of the hospital means the corridors look slightly dated due to the age of the construction, with large high ceilings and windows. My friend, who I'll call Dave for the purposes of this video, and several colleagues have reported quite dark occurrences whilst working in this hospital. This is just a handful of those tales. Whilst wheeling a patient back from minor surgery, two of Dave's colleagues reported seeing a hovering black mass travelling from bed to bed. This apparition has been seen on multiple occasions in the same ward, and it stops people in their tracks. When they go back to look after doing a double take, they can never see it. Banging noises are heard throughout the hospital and are usually accompanied by sightings in the peripheral vision of shadowy figures poking their head out from doorways and around corners. When the staff go to investigate, they find the areas empty. Doors opening and closing on their own despite no one being near them, and on one occasion, Dave had a door thrown in his face by an unseen force. Side note, I'd do the same if I saw him coming towards me, mind. Staff report feeling uneasy in the kitchen situated in the endoscopy department. It's as though they are being watched, despite there being no one else in the room with them. As soon as they leave, they state that the feeling immediately dissipates. One night, Dave and a female colleague were in theatres when Dave stopped dead in his tracks. Despite it being late at night and theatres not running at the time, he could clearly see what looked like a patient wearing a hospital gown walking through the theatres. The sight immediately unnerved him, and he stood stock still. He was then startled by his colleague, who had been trying to get his attention. When he turned to her, the colour had drained from her face. She informed him that loud music had begun to play in the theatre. It was at this point that he suddenly heard it. It was emitting from the same theatre room as the woman had walked into, and had immediately begun blaring as soon as she set foot in there. They cautiously approached and entered the room to turn the radio off. The room was empty. Only after making a quick escape did Dave tell her that he had seen someone walk in there just before the music had turned on. Another colleague of his stated that one night he had been eating his lunch in a canteen within the theatres when he suddenly had the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced around the room only to see a man stood in the darkened corner. He started as he laid his eyes on him and asked, "Are you alright, mate?" The figure did not reply, but instead walked out of the room without looking at him. Thinking it was a patient or a member of the public who had lost, he followed the man out into the corridor. Staying close behind him, he kept asking, "Excuse me?" but then proceeded to watch the figure as it entered into a building site of a new theatre area. Knowing that no one was allowed in the work area, and fearing for the person's safety, he ran in behind to be confronted by a large empty room. There was no sign of the intruder, and no visible explanation of where the man went to. Shortly after, Dave's colleague ran. Well, that's all from us here at Dark Entertainment. I hope that you've enjoyed the episode. We'd love to hear your stories. Feel free to post them in the comments or send us a message over Twitter or Facebook. You never know. We may include them on the channel. And if you'd like to give us a thumbs up and a like on YouTube, that would be greatly appreciated. It all helps with my crushing insecurities and my need to feel loved. Ta-ta!